Okay, let's dive in. So, you know how everyone's talking about AI these days, taking jobs and all that.
Right. It's definitely the big topic.
Well, it seems like over in the React developer community, they have their own kind of internal drama happening, a sort of civil war, actually.
Yeah, that's the term our source uses today. It's a really interesting piece from the Code Report, dated May 5th, 2025.
And what's kind of wild is seeing this internal conflict, right? I mean, React is huge, established.
Exactly. But it shows even mature tech isn't immune to, well, big shakeups and pre-passionate debates when the core ideas start shifting.
Absolutely. And the article uses this analogy I thought was great, React going through puberty.
Ha, yeah, it fits, doesn't it?
It really does because it's moved so far beyond just being, that client-side UI library. Remember, it was just manage your state, React updates the DOM.
Simpler times for sure.
Yeah,
That initial simplicity, that idea of the UI just being a function of your state, that clarity was a huge part of why it took off.
totally. But things have definitely evolved. Now, the big talk is React server components. The article calls them fancy serializable HTML template generators.
Which is a pretty accurate way to put it. Essentially, yeah, they're doing the UI rendering work on the server and then just shipping that HTML result over to the client.
So what's the win there? Why do that?
Well, there are some pretty compelling upsides. First big one is JavaScript bundle size.
The eternal struggle.
Right. The article uses a pop-up library, as an example, instead of sending all the JavaScript for that pop-up down, even if the user never clicks the button.
You just send the final rendered HTML if it's needed.
Exactly. Much lighter for the initial load.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's more than just saving bytes, isn't it? The article talks about composition.
Yeah, and that's always been React's superpower, right? Building complex UIs from smaller, reusable pieces. Server components kind of extend that idea across the network.
So you're composing server-rendered bits with client-rendered bits.
Precisely. And this ties into the user experience through something called suspense.
Suspense, okay. How does that fit in?
Well, suspense lets React show something immediately, like a loading spinner or a placeholder, while the actual content is still streaming in from the server.
So the user isn't just staring at a blank screen. They get instant feedback.
Exactly. You get that initial UI much faster. Even if the full data isn't there yet, it feels quicker.
Okay, so smaller code, better composition across server and client, faster perceived loading with suspense. It all sounds, well, pretty good on paper.
Right. It seems like a clear win.
So why the civil war? Why the drama? What are developers actually upset about?
Well, this is where it gets a bit more complicated. The article points out that these server components, they bring in a new layer of what it calls magic.
Magic, like it's too abstracted.
Sort of. It means using them isn't just a matter of, npm install React. It
Mhm.
requires more underlying infrastructure than maybe people were used to.
Okay, let's dig into that magic problem then.
Hmm.
What exactly is needed? It's not just updating React itself.
No, definitely not. The article breaks it down into three main requirements. First, you need a bundler, like Webpack or TurboPack, that's smart enough to figure out, okay, this component runs on the server, this one runs on the client.
Right, it has to differentiate, use
Oh.
client and use server directives and all that.
Exactly. Then second, you obviously need a server environment that can actually process these server components and stream the resulting HTML.
Makes sense. And third,
Third, you need a client-side router that understands how to receive and handle that incoming stream from the server, integrating it into the existing client-side app.
and the article's point is that, well, not every JavaScript developer is necessarily an expert in configuring bundlers and setting up server infrastructure and stream-aware routers.
Precisely. It adds layers of complexity that, weren't really there when React was purely a client-side library.
Okay, so this complexity.
Yes.
How does Next.js fit into this picture? Because the article heavily links the two.
Yeah, this is key. The React team essentially partnered very closely with the Next.js team at Vercel. The article frames it as this multi-year bet.
A bet that server components would be the future and Next.js would be the way to use React with them.
That seems to be the core idea presented, kind of making Next.js the default recommended framework for modern React.
But the article suggests this bet hasn't entirely landed perfectly. It talks about a failed bet narrative emerging.
Right. And it points to sort of two main groups who have concerns. First, there are individual developers.
What are their issues?
For many, especially if they aren't building, say, a massive full-stack application, Next.js can feel like overkill. It brings a lot of opinions and infrastructure, you know?
Like maybe for a simpler site, you don't need all the server-side rendering and routing complexities it introduces.
Exactly. It can feel like unnecessary complexity compared to maybe just using React with a simpler client-side router.
Okay, so that's one group. Who's the other?
The other group is the authors of other React frameworks. Think Remix, Gatsby, Redwood.js, etc.
Ah, the competition.
Yeah. And the article uses this kind of evocative analogy, feeling like the missing dad and stepbrother are off in Tahoe together.
Meaning React, the dad, and Next.js, the stepbrother, are super close, leaving the other frameworks feeling a bit left out or secondary.
That's the sentiment, yeah. A feeling that Next.js gets preferential treatment or insights because of that close Vercel partnership, making it harder for others to compete on a level playing field.
So boiling it down, the root issue for both developers and other framework authors seems to be this growing difficulty in separating React, the library, from Next.js, the framework, and even Next.js from Vercel, the company.
That seems to be the crux of the tension. Yes, it's getting harder to see the lines between them.
And this leads to that pretty pointed concern mentioned in the article, the Vercel money machine.
Right. The worry is that the push towards server components and the tight integration with Next.js might be influenced, at least partly, by Vercel's business interest in selling hosting optimized for Next.js.
Even if pure server-side rendering isn't necessarily the best technical choice for every single React app out there.
That's the concern being raised. Is the tech direction being driven purely by technical merit, or are commercial interests playing a significant role, potentially leading towards a kind of vendor lock-in?
Okay, that's a lot to chew on. So if you're a developer listening and you're thinking, maybe the full Next.js Vercel ecosystem isn't for me.
Yeah.
What are the alternatives the article mentions?
It highlights a few key ones. First, there's React Router v7. You might remember its previous incarnation as Remix.
Right, Remix. They merged with Shopify.
Yeah.
But the router lives on. What's its angle?
It really leans into web standards, things like the request response model, form handling. It's less opinionated than Next.js in some ways, and can be paired with something like Vite to build a full stack setup, more focus on fundamentals.
Okay, React Router. What else?
Then there's Tanstack Start. This is from Tanner Lindsley, who's, huge in the React ecosystem, React Query, React Table.
Oh yeah, everybody uses Tanstack Query.
Exactly. So Tanstack Start is his take on a full-stack framework. It's built on TypeScript, includes SSR, streaming, server functions, bundling, kind of the whole package. It's still in beta, I believe, but coming from him, it carries a lot of weight.
So a more batteries-included approach, but maybe outside that direct Vercel orbit.
That seems to be the idea. And then, interestingly, the article mentions a third option suggested by the React team itself.
Which is?
Build your own framework.
Wow. Okay. That sounds intense.
It definitely is. But they acknowledge that for some apps with really unique constraints, maybe none of the existing meta frameworks are the perfect fit, and rolling your own might be the way to go.
That really highlights how complex things have gotten, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That building your own framework is considered a viable path.
It really does. And, navigating all the server components, frameworks, bundlers, it can be pretty challenging. Which actually brings us neatly to our sponsor for this deep dive, React.gg.
Yes, React.gg. The article mentioned they provided the visuals that helped illustrate some of these concepts.
They did. And React.gg is positioned as a really excellent resource for learning this stuff. Getting up to speed on modern React, server components, even understanding how you might build those custom solutions we just talked about.
So what's their approach? How do they teach it?
What sounds really cool is how interactive it is. They use a mix of videos, text, really good visuals, but also practical coding challenges, kind of like LeetCode, but specifically for React concepts.
Oh, interesting. So less passive watching, more active doing.
Exactly, hands-on learning. And it's worth noting, the folks behind React.gg also created and maintain the UseHooks library.
Oh, the UseHooks one. Yeah, that's super popular.
Massively popular, hundreds of thousands of weekly downloads. So they clearly have deep practical experience with React and know the kinds of things developers struggle with day to day. That real-world context is baked in.
So it sounds like React.gg could be useful, whether you're like relatively new to React or you're experienced, but trying to wrap your head around React 19, server components, all the new stuff.
It seems like it caters to both. And if you are interested in checking it out, they're running a launch sale right now, 25% off for the next week only.
Nice. Definitely timely, given everything we're discussing. Okay, so let's try and summarize this civil war then.
Right. So basically, you have two main camps emerging, according to the source.
Camp 1.
Camp 1 values that original simplicity. Maybe they prefer traditional client-side React or frameworks that stick closer to that model. They might see the full-stack server component approach, especially tightly coupled with Next.js, as adding complexity they don't always need.
Okay, simplicity focused. And Camp 2.
Camp 2 is embracing the full-stack server-driven approach. They see the benefits of server components, the performance gains, the developer experience potentially offered by integrated frameworks like Next.js. They're leaning into that future.
Got it. So the key takeaway for you listening to this is what?
I think the main thing is just understanding that these aren't just like surface-level debates. These are fundamental architectural shifts happening in one of the web's biggest ecosystems.
Yeah, and knowing why these shifts are happening, the technical reasons, the potential business motivations we talked about, is becoming really crucial for making smart choices when you're building stuff with React.
You really need to think about your project's needs, your team's skills, and which side of this evolving landscape makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? This trend we're seeing, not just with React Next Vercel, but potentially elsewhere too. This tighter integration of libraries, frameworks, and hosting platforms.
Is it ultimately good for the web?
Right. Does it lead to, more streamlined, powerful development?
Mhm.
Or does it maybe risk creating walled gardens, making the ecosystem more complex, maybe less open in the long run?
That's definitely something worth thinking about as we see how all this continues to play out.